Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do one of my favorite kind of videos to plan and film, and that is that if you like this book, then you should read this one. And this particularly is going to be focused on science fiction books, but I've also done multiple videos on horror and fantasy, so if you're interested in the general idea of the video concept, I definitely recommend checking out my playlist, which should be linked in the cards and description box. Otherwise, I have new pairings here for science fiction. I'm pairing some pretty popular books with some books that I'm hoping will be a little bit more underhyped and hopefully something that you can add to your TBR. I know whenever I finish an amazing book, I'm always looking for something similar, and so I'm hoping this book will give you some good inspiration. All that being said, let's get into the pairings. First up, let's talk about Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which is his popular follow-up to The Martian, where we follow an astronaut who wakes up on a spaceship with his memory a little bit foggy as to why he is there, but soon enough it comes back to him the fact that he is out there to save the world, but he appears to be alone as his fellow astronauts have died, and the story goes from there. I think a lot of you are at least familiar with that one because it was really big and buzzy when it came out. And so the book that I want to compare to it is We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor. And this follows a man in the near future who comes into a bunch of money and spends that money on a procedure that will allow his mind to be saved after his death and then brought back in some way in the future when that technology exists in order to do that. And so right at the beginning of the story, he gets into an accident and then wakes up in the future in basically the mind of a computer, and the story again goes from there. I like to keep the synopsises of my books pretty short and sweet if you don't know. But basically, I want to recommend these two books together. Not that they have the exact same premise, although there certainly is some overlap, but more so in tone. I think that these books both explore very accessible aspects of hard science fiction. So they do talk about real science, but in a very accessible way to a layperson, and also they bring in a lot of humor. Both books are very jokey and definitely like to make fun as they go along. And I think for a lot of people, they have read either of those books via audio. They are technically Audible exclusives, which I don't like to technically recommend, but I'm going to do anyway. But they are both done by Ray Porter, who is a really renowned and one of my favorite narrators on there. And so I think if you like the experience of the audiobook of one of these, you're going to really like the audiobook for the other one. Again, I just thought they were both very similar. They both have a main character who is very likable. He's very much an everyman, and it's just easy to follow. Both books are fun. Technically, the We Are Bob series is the beginning of a longer running series of books, so you do have more to pick up if you enjoy the first one. So those are my first two pairings there. Next, I want to actually compare two trilogies. The first one being the Machineries of Empire series that starts with Nine Fox Gambit by Yoon Ha Lee. This follows a soldier who agrees to have the consciousness of a dead general put into her mind in order to get his military expertise. And then the series that I want to compare it to very loosely is the series that starts with Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie. And this is the Redditch trilogy. And in this one, we follow an entity that was originally the mind of a ship. However, at the beginning of the story, you find out that they have been separated from the ship and are now in the body of an individual, and they are out seeking revenge. Now, I'm hesitant to make a really close comparison because I'll admit that in terms of premise of the stories, they are quite different. So if you're looking for the same story and plot points, you're not necessarily going to get it here. And I would actually say that the first two books are the least similar to each other. So Ancillary Justice did not really remind me of Nine Fox Gambit. However, if you go further into the series, I suddenly started to see comparisons, and that's the fact that if you go further into this trilogy here, the first book has a lot of hard science, it's military science fiction, and it's dense and confusing and definitely is hard to get into. But when you get into the later books, this series you discover is actually very humorous, and it's very quaint and cozy and funny, and the characters are constantly watching like K-pop dramas, and there's just so much jokes that are just woven into the story in a very subtle way. But once you notice how much humor the author puts into his books, you won't be able to see the story without it. And so I actually want to say that the later two books, Ancillary Sword and Ancillary Mercy, gave me similar vibes, because while the first book is all about revenge, and certainly there's aspects of that in the later books, but at the same time, these books become really cute and cozy, and the characters are constantly drinking tea, and there's a lot of very subtle British humor throughout these. And so again, I think that if you like the tone of the later books in either series, you will like the other one. Again, it's a loose comparison, but just looking at other reviewers online, I do find that a lot of people who like one series like this one as well. So keep that in mind. I'm a little cautious with this comparison, but I also think that it totally holds up. Next, I want to talk about Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson. And this is a story that is set in a future where we have colonized Mars, and it takes the reader through the different stages. So the traveling to Mars, and then the original setup of the colony, and as it progresses. Full disclosure, at the time of recording this, I've actually only read half of the book, and I did put it down at the time. I struggled a lot with the character work. There was a lot of focus on the relationships, but what I loved about the book was the hard science, the imagining of the future, which I understand to be very accurate based off of what people are projecting would happen. And so those aspects I loved. And so I want to recommend a book for perhaps people who liked Red Mars, or more so people who like the idea of Red Mars, but are perhaps turned off by the length of those books, how dense they are, and are looking for a similar idea, but maybe in a smaller, simpler package. And so for those readers, I want to recommend The Martian Race by Gregory Banford. And this takes place in a near future, or actually the past, because it's set in like 2018. But essentially there is a prize in order to send or motivate different private organizations to send astronauts to Mars. And so we follow this expedition who goes there. They explore and do research and set up a colony, and we follow them over the course of time, and there are time jumps along the way. And so I thought that this book was similar in the idea of what it's trying to do, very similar in terms of the plot, but as opposed to the other books, which are a trilogy, this is a standalone. It's very accessible, it's very focused on the characters, and it's quite easy to understand. The author, I do believe, still has some scientific background. He is a professor of physics, I think, and so you do get that accuracy that I was looking for. But again, this one is just much more self-contained. So I think if you want a more epic scale version of that, I do think you're going to be much more satisfied with the Red Mars trilogy, which I do plan to go back to. But this kind of gave me a taste of what I was looking for without that larger commitment. And honestly, just the characters in Red Mars, they were all sleeping with each other, and I just did not care. Next up, for those of you that love The Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov, this of course is a follow-up to his short story collection, I, Robot, but this is actually a novel that begins a series of robot mystery novels. And so in this one, we follow a human detective who is paired up with a robot in order to solve a murder. And so it is a murder mystery, but it has of course that science fiction element, because we are seeing how basically robots are included or excluded in modern society, and you get to see the prejudice and all of that. And I thought that it was really interesting in terms of the sci-fi elements. My personal complaint is that I wasn't particularly attached to the mystery itself. I found it to be quite dry and average, and I just didn't really care who did it. But it did give me a lot of similar vibes to a more modern sci-fi mystery. So the book I want to recommend is Lock-In by John Scalzi, which is set in a near future where there's a virus that causes people all across the world to fall into what seems to be comas, so their bodies are not able to move, however their minds actually stay active. And so in order to help these people, they build these artificial bodies that basically serve as surrogates, allowing them to move around and still participate in society. So at the beginning of the story, we follow someone who is in this state. So they are in this surrogate animatronic body and are starting their work at the FBI, and they are partnered with a human and are off to solve again a murder mystery case. And I would say that the actual murder mystery in this one held my attention a lot more, but once again, what really made the story so wonderful was the world building around this perceived future, just getting to see how people are treated differently, the disabilities, and just how they are othered in society, but then also how they are integrated. And the world building is woven into the mystery itself, so it is very relevant, and I thought it was really well done. There is a follow-up book which I also recommend, and I just thought those were a really good example of sci-fi mysteries that for me really include the elements I love of both genres. Finally, I want to recommend a book for those that love the classic science fiction story of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. This follows an expedition that sets out to track down what they believe to be a giant narwhal that is attacking ships. However, they find something different and end up on a submarine that is captained by Mr. Nemo. And the story turns into an epic sci-fi adventure, and they are stuck on this boat, but they get to see amazing wonders throughout their journey. Now, I really enjoyed that one, but it gave me similar vibes to a more modern book, and that is, of course, my all-time favorite, Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, which I pretty much include in every video lately. But this book follows an expedition that goes out to find out what happened to a previous expedition that was filming a mockumentary all about mermaids in the Marianas Trench. Something went wrong, and the mockumentary crew never came back, and so they're actually sending out scientists now to discover what is out there. And wouldn't you know, mermaids are possibly real. Now, I want to preface this comparison by, of course, mentioning that Jules Verne's book I would describe as sci-fi adventure, while this I would describe as sci-fi horror. I really think it's a stretch for me to try to convince you that 20,000 Leagues could be horror. There's elements of that, but it's not really horror by today's standards, but this one definitely gets pretty dark and gruesome. Why I want to compare these books is, of course, they're about deep sea adventure, and they're both very focused on the scientific aspects of the stories. So one thing that people complain about, but I personally loved about 20,000 Leagues Into the Sea, is the fact that there's so much time spent on the scientific facts. They spend so much time talking about longitude and latitude and just the different coordinates and where they're at, but there's also a lot of focus spent on marine biology, and I thought those aspects were so interesting because I loved all of the information we're getting, and we were getting so much, but I did not tire of it. And so that reminded me a lot of this one, because while it's typically classified as horror, I also think that it's a book that will appeal to science fiction readers because the author really takes the time to explore marine biology, a lot of talk about conservation of the ocean, and those themes are really woven into the story, and there's just a lot of thoughtful scientific explanations that are brought into this book that she didn't have to put in there, but made the book so much better. So if you love reading about the ocean and marine biology, I really recommend you read both books. I love them both, and I just love reading about those topics. So I thought they were both fantastic. So that's it. We've made it to the end of the video here. I would love to hear of the comparisons I made. Which ones do you agree with, and which books are you planning on picking up for yourself? I would also love to hear if you have better pairings. So if you have a different book you would recommend with one of the books I mentioned. If you enjoyed these videos, please give them a thumbs up, share them around online, and don't forget to watch the rest of my playlist for even more pairings. And if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of adult science fiction as well as adult fantasy, horror, and thrillers. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.